So I'm going to talk about what I refer to as the nurture of intelligent thought. And I use this idea because I've become very fascinated with studies lately that, from the past and presently, that try to make people smarter. I think that's something the country really needs. My bias is that I really like smart people, and I'd like to see more of them. I'd like to have more of them in our country and around me. So it's going to be a lifelong endeavor for me. And I do go into schools a lot, and I don't find enough smart people, but I come bearing good news is that we can do something about this. I've been doing experiments on this phenomenon since about the time many of you in this room were in diapers, and I hope some of this research will be stale to those of you who have been in the field for a while, but there's some new stuff as well. I'm still amazed. One of the reasons I've been able to stay studying the same problem for so long is that I'm still in shock at the first studies that I did, where you could do a small thing that changes the environment in a seemingly trivial way, and it makes a huge difference. And I'm delighted to say that I've seen these things playing out in schools as well, and I hope to share some of the good news about that at the end. So, the gender STEM gap. I'm going to show you, some of the effects that I'm sure this group is all aware of, but I want to say that although I think there is a problem with the gender gap, this is not the problem I lie awake in bed worrying about very much, because across the board, except for a couple of very circumscribed areas in hard math and science, women are winning in the battle of the sexes in terms of achievement. They're getting more college degrees, they're doing better in high school, they're easier to work with. I don't know if, a lot of our studies are done with women because men don't show up when you schedule them. they're just sort of better at transacting the academic world, I've found. So I want to compare, sort of the outcomes. Here's the problem in the pattern of results. Very early on, according to some early developmental research, not early in terms of the field, but early in terms of the subjects' lives, at 24 hours of old, girls demonstrate slightly less interest in spatial tasks. Do you guys know the work of Simon Baron-Cohen, who enters that wonderful moment in your life where you've just had a baby and he comes into your laboratory, he comes into this great scene with stimuli. And they find that boys and girls differ, boy and girl babies differ in terms of what they look at. Boys tend to be more interested in mobiles and things, gears that move. Baby girls tend to be interested in human faces. And this, to people who believe that the math gap, the spatial gap is real and hardwired, say that this is very connected to the graduate school gap in, let's say, engineering. That's a controversial point, but it is interesting that you notice these differences at birth, before socialization can take hold. At the K through 12 level, girls perform at or above the same level as boys on tests and in school. At the middle school level, something starts happening with girls where they're doing as well as boys in math generally, but they don't have as much confidence, right? So they're underestimating their abilities, even though they are quite strong. At the college level, women tend to perform worse on standardized tests, timed tests of math, but they do as well in their courses, yet far fewer choose hard math and science majors. And this is supposed to look to you like the Homeland Security threat chart. Come through as well as I hoped, but it looks good on my screen. The sort of end of the line, the thing that is causing people to write NSF reports and task forces and stuff, is that a small minority of women choose fields in which hard math and science are prominently featured. Now, what does keep me awake at night is the black-white gap. And I'm going to mention it in this context, not because I'm going to talk a whole bunch about it. I mean, my focus is going to be largely on women. But the fixes are generally the same. Many of the processes that would allow us to address this problem are the same between women in science and black students across the board. But the pattern is a great deal more upsetting, and the consequences are a great deal more dire. There is emerging an increasing amount of research done with babies. You can now pretty reliably measure baby intelligence before kids are able to talk. And when we do these studies, we see that black and white babies exhibit equal amounts of measured intelligence. But very quickly, as kids grow up, they start showing lower standardized test scores. At the high school level, 50% of black students drop out. At the college level, black students are half as likely to go to college and twice as likely to drop out. And the worst is that there is a pipeline that if you drop out of high school and you're black, you have a 30% chance of ending up in prison in this country, or ending up missing. And so I have a new statistic to talk to you about that you may not have heard, and that's this. 1 million black males in this country are missing. What do we mean by missing? James Flynn and I looked at the data on using the census and the number of birth certificates issued for all groups, all ethnic groups in America. It's impossible to be born in this day and age without a birth certificate, and it's very hard to die without a death certificate issued. So you subtract the number of death certificates from birth certificates, you use the census to see where people are, and for every other group, you account for nearly everyone. Everyone's accounted for. When you do this with black males, 1 million are unaccounted for. We don't know where they are. We don't think they're dead, but they're not. They're so removed from the mainstream that they are completely unaccounted for, and this has got to be costing the society a lot. The other statistic that points to inefficient schooling is that by the age of 14, 2% of the black male population is missing. Now, imagine, so there's that statistic, and then there's the statistic that the accompanying statistic is that we're not outraged by this, right? That, can you imagine if 1 million white girls went missing in this country? That there would be, we would figure out which country to invade to fix this problem. So the question is, this is what keeps me up at night. Where are these people, and why have we failed them? How can we understand this failure, and what can we do about it? It's very linked to some of the same processes as women's underperformance in science. So why do women underperform on tests in math and science? Why do black and Latino students underperform in school on tests? Well, none of the traditional explanations could fully account for the gap in performance on tests and in school. And this is what led Claude to suggest that there's a psychological explanation to address the unexplained part of this gap. None of the traditional explanations, poverty, the quality of schools, all these things matter. But it turns out that even when you account for them, there's still an unexplained part of the gap. And so for me, the critical ingredient in this is the realization that intelligence is a fragile thing. It's both fragile and malleable. And this, for me, is a key to understanding why students aren't doing as well as they could be. The gap that really bugs me as I go through schools, when I go in, I usually go in looking for a gender gap or a race gap. But what hits you over the head is looking across all the students, and really it's the gap between what kids could be and what they're allowed to become. The gap between their potential and what they are able to realize in terms of their educational outcomes. So just for those of you who care about the definitions, I'll define intelligence the way that the traditional IQ people define intelligence. A score on an IQ test, performance in school, all these things, verbal fluency, all these things are linked to intelligence. One of my favorite colleagues who writes well said this: human intelligence is among the most fragile things in nature. It doesn't take much to distract it, suppress it, or even annihilate it. We tend to think of intelligence, in this country in particular, as something that's quite stable, stable across life and stable across situations. And I would argue that it is not stable across situations. That intelligence we think of as something inside the head, a lump of ability that stays stable, but if you look at the data, it looks very much like it's not. So for example, New York tests kids' intelligence as soon as they're ready to apply for school. This is what drove us out of the city and into the suburbs. In order to get in school, they will test your kid's intelligence at 3 years old, which is completely ridiculous, because if you retest the kid a week later, they'll get a very different score. Their intelligence test scores for children until about the age of 16, 18 remain highly unstable, highly unstable. And so the notion that we're sort of judging and labeling and putting a permanent score on somebody in a situation where that score is going to change is quite problematic. We also tend to think of intelligence as something that is uniquely inside the head. And I think the work of a lot of people, in particular Robert Sternberg, suggests that intelligence can be better thought of as a transaction. That, let's say you ask me a question on which I'm supposed to demonstrate my intelligence, then you're not necessarily tapping in just to my intelligence. There's other factors working. How I feel about you, how you feel about me. We tend to not think of it that way, and I think we miss some very important phenomena. It is in terrible taste to quote yourself. Nonetheless, just to make sure my position is quite clear, human intelligence is more fragile and malleable than most people think. I don't think it's the most fragile thing in the world. But it's far more fragile and malleable than the makers of SAT tests and such would have us believe. Now, as I say, intelligence is sort of a social transaction. Psychologists have found many factors that can sort of suppress our intelligence, that make it, because intelligence is fragile, is responsive to situations. What I refer to as interpersonal chemistry. You ever notice that you feel sort of more charming and funny with certain people than others? I mean, this has been an observation that's been around a long time. William James said that we are as many different people as we have social contacts. Each person brings something slightly, perhaps profoundly different out of us. And people's personalities change when they change context. That's been long known. And so this is really just extending this to the concept of intelligence. So, you know, I'm a popular professor at NYU. My students think very highly of me. I've won teaching awards. But every time I'm with my mother-in-law, I feel like just dramatically less smart and interesting. Andrew Fellini, who's in the audience, knows exactly what I'm talking about because he knows my mother-in-law. It's just quite amazing. I go, geez, how did I get to be so dumb? And when I had an advisor at Princeton, he was a very famous social psychologist, and every week I would work really hard to prepare for our meeting, and he would, without trying to, I'd get into the meeting and I would immediately feel 15 IQ points just being sucked out of my brain. Like say things that I didn't mean to say, and those kind of things that you would say later. Why did I say that? That was so stupid. So this is, and I don't think I'm the only one. I hope I'm not the only one. In fact, I'm not, because a very senior, brilliant faculty member told me that he has exactly the same experience when he walked into my advisor's office. So that there was that sort of interpersonal chemistry effect. When people's safety is threatened, they also lose IQ points. There's a wonderful sociologist at NYU who studies the effect of homicides in a neighborhood on the IQ scores of the children who live there. Patrick Sharkey. So in the 2 weeks following a homicide in the south side of Chicago, the IQ scores of the black children within a pretty large radius around the homicide will suffer a half a standard deviation decrement in their IQ scores, just because they heard gunshots in the night. We also know that threatened belongingness. Now, there's great evidence that if you are made to feel that you don't fit in a situation, that if you've been rejected by people, or that you even will be rejected in the future, and then somebody gives you an IQ test, you'll lose close to a half a standard deviation on high order reasoning. You're good at memorizing little things, the little sort of drill and kill kinds of things, but if you have to think through something that, of complexity, if you have to use your fluid intelligence, you will become remarkably less smart. And finally, what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the session is stereotype threat or identity threat. I know some of you have already heard this, so I'll go pretty quickly here. I define it differently than others. I like to define it as the apprehension arising from the awareness of a negative stereotype or a personal reputation in a situation where that stereotype or reputation is relevant to that situation. We all experience this from time to time. The argument, though, is that certain groups, because of the way society is arranged, experience it a lot. So it's quite contingent on the situation. When I took my first academic position at the University of Texas, an interesting place because even though there are a lot of Jewish people there, there's still a lot of people who've only met 2 Jews in their life. And when you don't know many Jews, you will, when you only know a few members of a group, you tend to stereotype. And so I met one of these people, and she asked me to explain why Jews were so rich, why they were so good with money. And I'm like, really? The Aronson family has never been good with money. There's a trail of bad investments, getting stolen from, and it's been a bad scene. So I asked her what she meant, and she told me that she didn't know many Jews, but she knew, the few that she had worked with this was a realtor. She was putting them in big houses, 3-car garages, all the trimmings. And then she said, do you folks have something genetic that makes you good with money? And so I sort of called a timeout and gave her a brief lecture on stereotypes and prejudice. And we were at lunch, and she goes, at the end of it, she was like a good student, an A student. She said, I get it. So I only know a few Jews, and I know about this stereotype, so now I'm applying the stereotype to all Jews in the world. And I said, got it. Don't do it again. And so everything was fine until it came time to pay the bill for lunch. Because I didn't know what the etiquette was. This was my first house purchase. What do? Do I offer to pay for lunch, or does she? So I defaulted to my let's be a nice guy mode, and I said, I'm going to pay for lunch. This is all in my head, by the way. And then it hit me that if I do that, I could reestablish, I could confirm the stereotype that I had worked for 5 minutes to debunk. And so I said to myself, I'm not going to, okay, that's it, I'm not going to pay for lunch. And then it hit me. There's this other stereotype about being stingy. So I was really stuck. Now the key to this is that all this time, there was a conversation going around me, and I was completely unaware of it, because I was processing this sort of Woody Allen stuff in my head, right? Now that's humorous, and ultimately I don't really care what Texas realtors think, because I moved to New York. My Jewishness was no longer a problem, because we have Jews in all flavors there, all varieties. And so, then I have to deal with the sort of the Texas stereotype, because I was not from Texas. It's a whole other story. So that's kind of humorous, but if you think about an African-American kid taking an IQ test in this country, by the time kids are about 6, depending on the context, depending on the school they go to, they're quite aware of the stereotypes that society has about them. They can recite them. So it's now something that is vitally important to whether you will turn into a successful person or not a successful person is being tested. And that is a burden. A burden that could potentially derail you if you're taking that test. And of course, women called upon in math class. And on the individual level, George W. Bush in public speaking. People kept telling me that George Bush is smarter than he seems on TV. And when a friend of mine told me that, Dick Nisbet, went to the White House and Bush was president back then, he said, my God, this guy is so much smarter than anybody's ever seen. Now, why would that be? Well, it's because he developed a reputation as a dummy, and when the cameras were on, it jacked up the pressure on him. That's my theory, anyway. If that were true, then people would underestimate his actual, let's say, SAT score. So for the last 6 years or so, I've been surveying people on getting them to estimate various people's SAT scores. I have George W. Bush's SAT score. Keep it in my pocket. So we do this, and this was in the old system where the total SAT was 1,600 possible. Right? And people estimated that it's 1080, just north of dead average. His actual score was 1,330. So he's smarter, and depending, there's many implications of this, of course. It could be that SATs are not telling us about the things we need to know. That's one implication. The other is that the guy is smarter than we think. As he would say, they misunderestimated me. He actually did say that. And what we have found with Stereotype Threat is that systematically, people who are exposed to stereotypes, the tests they take misunderestimate their intelligence. There are now meta-analyses of all this work that show it sort of estimates the degree to which, the degree of latent ability that's not being picked up by these tests. Now there's tons of anecdotal evidence on this. I've talked to thousands of students, and this is the kind of thing you hear. When I talk in class, I feel like I'm on stage, like everyone's thinking, oh, what's the black girl going to say? But I don't speak up in class much anymore, so I guess it's not a big deal. Group work was a nightmare. I could tell no one thought my ideas were any good because I'm Latino. My current favorite, everyone expects me to be good at math because I'm Asian, so I feel extra stupid because I'm not so good at math. This poor guy, at the beginning of every semester, he said students would try to sit near him. They could cheat off his tests, and he would have this incredible dilemma. Should I tell them? And you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm not that kind of Asian. Not so good at math. That's an interesting stressor, that people expect more of you because of your ethnicity. So it's another sort of kind of stereotype threat. So how do you bottle this? Well, we did a series of studies in which we reasoned that if we could get people to relax about confirming stereotypes, then maybe we can improve their performance. So we did a series of studies in which we give black and white college students a difficult verbal exam, the GRE in this case, where we called the really hard items. These were Stanford students, so they were very well prepared and good students. And in one condition we say, we give them the test the way you always get these tests. This is a measure of your verbal ability. It will predict how well you do in all verbal domains. It's very important. The other group, we say, this is a psych study. We are not at all interested in measuring your ability. We're interested in understanding the problem-solving process. So you're going to take this test. We want you to work really hard on it, but we're not measuring your ability. And so when we do that, we see a big difference. When we're measuring their ability, a big black-white gap. When we reduce their stereotype threat, we see quite a big difference. This is uncorrected. When you plug in their SAT scores, it gets even better. When you correct for their prior SATs. It doesn't take much to get these effects. In another study, we simply give everybody the same instruction set. That is, we're not measuring your ability. However, for half, they're given, everybody gets a questionnaire, but for half, the last item on the questionnaire asks them to indicate what their race is right before they begin the test. And we see that if you're asked to indicate your race, you go down in performance. So there's been lots and lots of studies that followed in this wake, showing similar effects with women taking math tests, Latinos taking verbal tests, old people taking short-term memory tests, poor students taking verbal tests, black students taking tests of miniature golf. It's not our biggest educational problem. It is so cool because all you have to do, if you're not aware of this study, you should read it. If you have people playing golf in a laboratory, black students and white students, and you tell them that it's a measure of their kinesthetic intelligence, you attach the word intelligence, which is sort of like, if you're a stigmatized group, that word sort of resonates. And you get a worse score if you're black, and a better score if you're white. However, if you say this is a measure of natural athletic ability, it flips. So the black students shoot better golf under that condition. It shows you really the power of stereotypes to affect your behavior. Women taking tests of political knowledge. We had a political knowledge survey, and we had our research assistants calling women on the phone and asking them a series of political knowledge questions. Now, I hadn't known this before, but there are theories as to why women aren't good at political knowledge. These sort of complex cognitive theories about not being able to process political, which is kind of weird when you think about the other stereotypes about women being that they think well about social interactions. Nonetheless, there are lots of theories about why, or there's some theories about why women just don't think about politics very well. So we had male and female interviewers calling people up, and we found that if women were asked the questions by a male, they did worse on the same set of questions than if they were asked the same questions by a female. White males taking tests of social sensitivity. Princeton students, one of the ways that you can feel stereotype threatened is if you feel like an outsider in some way. So at Princeton, the students that feel like outsiders are the ones that didn't go to prep schools, who sort of went to backwater high schools, and so they feel as though they don't fit the mold of the sort of typical preppy Princeton student. All we had to do to lower their math scores was to ask them before they took a math test to describe in a few words what their high school was like. So you think about their background, right? And that lowers their math test score. And one of my favorite studies is an old one now, white males taking math tests. Now, that is not, white males are not stereotyped as being bad at math. But we were starting to hear critiques of our work in which people were saying, oh, I see, so black people aren't less intelligent, they just have this innate sort of vulnerability to testing situations, which, if you think about it, isn't that the same thing as lacking intelligence? And so our charge was to say, no, no, no. This is a human predicament that all of us experience, but it's just the case that black students sort of have to face these challenges much more than white students. So we set out to a real stringent test of this. We wanted to find the brightest students we could find and the whitest. So it turns out the smartest people on Stanford campus are white, male, engineering graduate students and engineering majors. And when you meet these students, you can just sort of feel the smart coming off of them. They have so much confidence. All of these people had near perfect SAT scores on the math section. So we put them in a situation where we wanted to stereotype threaten them, and that was not hard to do because in one condition of the experiment, we told them that we wanted to measure their math ability. What makes some people smarter at math than others? And you could see like a smile forming on their lips because their feeling was like God created me to do mathematics. And so that's what we were up against. But so in one condition we said we're measuring your math ability, and in the other condition we said you might want to know what this study, why we're doing this. We want to see why Asians are so good at math. And we showed them a little article that talked about an Asian-white math gap. And so this is what happened. They scored 30% less well on this test. And I'm still in shock about this because really you think about confidence and innate ability as sort of these things that really bright people have. And yet the standard deviation unit, that's almost a full standard deviation, which is the entire size of the black-white gap, and we were able to create that in the lab. Now, these folks weren't giving up, but they did say they felt like the problems were harder in that one condition than the other. They were the same problems, but now they had this Asian in their head that was sort of competing for their attention, right? So it became harder for them. So there have been a number of conclusions drawn from lots and lots of studies. We see the impairment on IQ tests, and over time, as people sort of protect their self-esteem from failure, we see lower achievement. Douglas Massey has done some terrific long-term work with freshmen around 28 different colleges and finds that when you measure stereotype vulnerability, it predicts pretty well underperformance on GPA. The results we found the mediators. I know Tony Schmader was here, so I won't belabor this, but there's a lot of mediators of this. We found in our lab, for example, that when women think they're about to have their math intelligence measured and we give them a hand grip to squeeze and say, squeeze this for as long as you can, they squeeze it, they maintain their grip on this thing for significantly less time than equally prepared women who don't think that the math test is going to be used to measure their abilities. Right? So it seems to have executive function, self-control, depletion properties, stereotype threat. We have not found any evidence that in our studies, people are just giving up. There's no scrap of evidence. We can't prove that, but there's a lot of evidence showing that even when you force students, when you arrange the incentives so that it would be ridiculous to not try, the effects get even stronger. It induces high blood pressure in African American males. It can affect elite or non-elite students. It can arise as a function of simply mixing students together. We did a bunch of studies at NYU where we had black students taking a test at a table. In some conditions, it was just black students. In some conditions, we added a white student. And when you do that, you see the test scores of the blacks go down. So the salience of that makes their race salient. That induces a stereotype activation, and that suppresses performance. It's much more likely to affect African Americans than immigrant black students. Much more likely. So Kay Doe has done some terrific studies where she finds that immigrants from Africa, first generation immigrants, do not experience test underperformance under stereotype threat. Their children will, but they won't, because they have not been marinating in these stereotypes since childhood, right? So that often immigrants come over here, they learn that Americans think black people are inferior, and it doesn't add up for them. So when they get in these situations, they're not as affected by stereotype threat. So I think it's pretty compelling evidence that African Americans fail more because they're American than because they're African. We know about lots of different moderators on these effects. The more you care about a domain, the worse you will do when your intelligence is threatened by stereotype threat. The more you care about your connection to your group, the more stereotype threat you'll experience. The more you're aware of the stereotypes, and if you endorse the stereotypes, it's worse still. There's a thing called rejection sensitivity, where people worry about being rejected on the basis of race. We found in many studies that predicts quite nicely. And self-monitoring. We found that students who are high self-monitors are much less likely to experience stereotype threat than students that are low self-monitors. We have the opposite prediction going in. But it turns out that people who are high self-monitors are really good at sort of thinking about the situations they're in and considering the consequences, and the stereotype threat just sort of bounces right off them. So all that I've shown you now are stereotype threat effects in the laboratory. There's this thing called the real world, where real people take real tests. And the criticisms of stereotype threat have been, you've only done it in laboratories, and the idea being that, I think Paul Sackett said something like, who's a real testing maven, said, yeah, I get it. I get that stereotype threat will affect scores in the lab, but in the real world, with real high stakes, people can lay aside those concerns about confirming stereotypes and sort of try hard and do well. Well, that's an interesting hypothesis. So the Educational Testing Service tested this one out. They, as you might imagine, are not really thrilled with this work because it suggests that they think they have a dipstick into the brain, right? And that it's an unbiased dipstick. This work made them angry. And so they responded by doing a study with real AP Calculus test takers, women, who were doing this for real credit, 2,000 of them. And they did a very nice, elegant study. So they said, Steele and Aronson found that just by writing your race on the cover of the testing form or on the questionnaire right before you take the test undermines your performance. So we'll do half like that, and then we'll do the other half where you get the request for your your gender at the end of the test, where it can't prime stereotypes. So that's what they did, and here's what they found. So if you get the inquiry before, you can see that male students are outperforming female students by quite a nice margin. Look what happens when you move it to the end. Notice a couple of things. If you remind a guy that he's a guy before you give them a math test, he does a lot better than if you don't remind him that he's a guy. So there's a tip in there for you. Before you take a math test, say, I'm a guy. And if you remind a woman before she takes the math test, it has effects. Now, as you might imagine, the ETS was not happy with these results. And if you read the paper, they sort of talk about how, although these results look and are statistically significant, practically speaking, this won't add up to much. And so that's an interesting perspective. So one of the reviewers on the paper was so incensed that he reanalyzed the data using national statistics and found that roughly 5,000 women every year additional women every year would get AP Calculus credit if they simply moved the request to the end of the test. There is a problem inherent in that too, right? Fewer men would get AP Calculus credit. So what do? I suggested to them that they create a different form for men and women. It seemed like a logical thing. and they requested that I not talk to them anymore. they really don't like their own research very much. Now, another study was done, and this is by a friend of mine who's a terrific researcher named Sean Reardon. And he studied a natural experiment that compared high and low stakes testing. So California, and I probably don't need to tell you this because you're Californians, for a while was giving high school students a test just to see how much they learned in high school. Just sort of, not that hard of a test, but they just sort of basic competency. And then a while later, so they had a lot of data on how students from different groups were doing in this test. And they kept using the same test, but the legislature said, let's make this high stakes. Let's make this a prerequisite for graduation. If you don't pass the test, you don't graduate. Seemed like a logical thing because maybe people will work harder, study harder, and really take it seriously, the way Paul Sackett says they should be able to. So the question is, how did people do when the test was made high stakes? Okay, so bad colors. So the light bar is how people did when the test was low stakes. These are white students. The blue bar is how well they did when it was high stakes. Okay? And so the next group is Hispanics. It mattered a lot. They did worse. I apologize for the colors on this. Blacks did worse under high stakes. Now, he did all the controls relevant, the appropriate controls, so that prior abilities were accounted for. And so this really is a terrific sort of naturalistic experiment about what happens when you induce high stakes on a test across various groups. And Asians are interesting because they too underperformed. And you would wonder, well, why would that be? They aren't allegedly bad at school. But it turns out when you look deeper into the data, they're doing just as well on the math portion of the test, but they're doing worse in language arts under high pressure. We've done this study in the laboratory too, where we created a high and low stakes condition and then crossed that with whether students were primed with a stereotype or not. And the question is, will high stakes make stereotype threat go away, or will it have some other effect? So we repeated the low stakes conditions, which were like the past experiments. It's a lab study. Try as hard as you can. And these were students that were remedial students, I should say. They weren't terribly identified with doing well in school. In the high stakes condition, however, we said that if you don't do well on this, you got to try really hard here. And if we don't feel that you've tried hard enough, you'll just take another test. We have the students for 3 hours. You can leave if you try hard enough, but if you don't do well enough, then you'll stay here and take another test, and another test, and another test until the 3 hours is up. So the incentive for trying hard is high, and the stakes are high. And here's what we find. Under low stakes, these are low identified students, so we didn't expect much of a difference there. In the high stakes, we see that it makes matters worse to be under high stakes. So I think that the notion that somehow this is serious, this is going to count, will make these effects go away, has received no support whatsoever. Another real-world experiment is we wanted to examine the sort of Lawrence-Summers hypothesis that women can't do math at high levels because of biology. So we went into the highest level mathematics courses at the university we could find, and it's a very typical scene from course to course. You see a huge number of males, a large proportion of which are Asian males, and then a smallish huddle of women. These women are really good at math. They have sort of gone through so many levels that you would think, well, maybe stereotype threat's not an issue for them. We had the professor in his courses give a special exam, and he told the students something different in two conditions. In one condition, he said, I've been giving this test for 25 years. and it's a really good predictor of how well you will do in the future. And the other condition he added, and by the way, I've never seen a gender difference on this test in my 25 years of teaching. This is a Steve Spencer manipulation. And so here's what we find. In the control condition where their math intelligence is being measured, we see that these women are performing just as well as men. We came to think of these women as sort of like the Navy SEALs of calculus. They're really tough. And so what happens when we remove that stereotype threat is that they outperform the males in the class on this test. So they have this latent ability on these tests that's not being tapped when they're being given normal testing. And we worry that they will lack confidence because of that. And that if we could give them more of these experiences, then they would have the additional layer of confidence. All right, so those are the short-term effects. Now, I don't have too much time left, but I want to talk about the process of why this stuff is important. The reason this is important is because people come to conclusions about themselves on the basis of these tests. If you don't do well on these tests, we've seen a pattern of avoidance, that students will avoid these diagnostic situations, the stereotype threat. One response to these things is you can steer clear of them, right? So we found that what Judy Harris said about intelligence is really borne out in our research. She said, no circle is more vicious than the one having to do with intelligence. Children who may be only a little behind their peers to begin with tend to avoid those things that could have made them a little smarter. As a result, they fall further and further behind. Meanwhile, the kids who started out a little ahead are doing push-ups with their brains. And so there's this widening ability gap that starts with a stereotype vulnerability. So we find, for example, that when we give girls and minorities a choice of the level of challenge they want, and they're told that they can pick the items essentially for an upcoming test of their abilities, that girls and minorities will choose easier items. When gender is made salient, women avoid diagnosis of their math abilities. The effect is moderated by stigma consciousness, awareness of stereotypes. However, the good news is that they don't do this. They don't do the avoidance if they believe they can get smarter. We use Carol Dweck's measures of implicit theories of intelligence. That completely, if they believe they can get smarter, they don't avoid diagnosis or challenge. So how do we use this to improve performance? One of the ways suggested by Dweck and early research by me is to give people what's called a growth mindset, to teach them or to put them in the mindset that they can get smarter. And as you can see from the last studies, that helps in challenge. We went to North Carolina, where there's a big race gap in test scores, and we had kids in school take the end of grade exam. We made half of them aware of their race by asking them to indicate their race on the testing form, and cross-cut that with a manipulation of, by the way, do you know why we're giving you this test? We found that kids who take these tests learn a lot about mathematics by doing them. So we put them in I'm doing this to learn math mindset. So here's what happens. If you're given the growth mindset and your race is prompted, this is the effect that's really fascinating to me, because you actually do better than anyone else in the sample. So your race is made salient, but you're given this way of thinking about it, this mindset that actually turns the most threatening situation into the most performance boosting situation. I like that because it suggests that that stereotype threat can actually be a benefit under the right circumstances, that it can be an energizing challenge rather than a debilitating threat. We've done studies where we teach students to think of their minds as muscles and to think of their intelligence as malleable. And we find that for both blacks and whites who get several sessions of this learning, and they write letters to little kids about how your brain grows new neural connections, they come to believe it. And then 4 months later, they're getting higher GPAs across the board. Very exciting to me. We've done this in middle schools where we use their actual statewide test scores, and we do a number of psychological interventions, either a malleability of intelligence, or they get a role model who teaches them that everybody has difficulty when they transition to middle school, and you're no different. It'll get easier, which tends to de-stigmatize difficulty for students, right? So things are difficult because they're difficult, not because you're stupid. And we had a control group in which kids marinated in a drug abuse message. And what we find is that for Latinos in reading relative to controls in one condition, both of these conditions are more than a standard deviation of gain on the statewide test. And look at the math gap. In the control condition, we see that boys are outscoring girls, but we close almost completely that gap with the malleability, and we fully close it in the role model condition. One thing that I'm really, really excited about is what we refer to as identity salience. There are many different identities that people have. Race is an ascribed identity. Gender is an ascribed identity. You can't do anything about those labels. However, there are achieved identities. There are superordinate identities that people can have. And one of the things I'm very excited about is that really successful teachers are giving students sort of these new superordinate identities. You're not black, you're Mrs. Johnson's student. That's how I want you to think of yourself, and you're special because of that. And so we did some lab studies on this, and we looked at spatial ability, because as this group knows, spatial ability is one of those male-female differences that is very robust. And some people, there's some interesting phenomena around this. It seems in some studies to be mediated by testosterone, which means that people who believe in these biological differences have a strong belief that that's the end of the story, right? These are hardwired sex differences, and there's nothing to do about it. However, as much research shows, spatial abilities are highly trainable. If you doubt me, play Tetris for 15 minutes. You get good fast, right? But we wondered whether identity salience could move scores around on this apparently biologically driven finding. So we gave students a test like this, and in this is the classic Vandenberg mental rotation task. Your job is to quickly as you can take this item and say which of the two items on the right are that item rotated in space. You get pretty big gender effects on this, but we, following from Margaret Chee's work on identity salience, we had students, before they took a series of 60 or so of these, we asked them a few questions. And in one condition, these were students at, I should say, at a highly selective liberal arts college in the Northeast. I won't say which one. But we asked students in the control condition, could you tell us a couple of things somebody would like about living in the Northeast? That's right there. And you see a sizable, not huge, but a sizable gender difference. Boys outscoring girls. In one condition, in another condition, we asked them something that makes them think about their gender. We asked them, could you tell us a couple of things a person might like about living in a co-ed dorm? That gets you thinking about your gender, and look what happens. Again, you remind a guy that he's a guy and he does better on a spatial abilities test, and if you remind a woman, it undermines her performance a little bit. But what if you get them thinking about this achieved identity? We ask them, could you tell us a couple of things a person might like about being a student at a highly selective liberal arts college? That gets you thinking about how smart you are. And that makes the gap almost disappear. What's interesting to me about this, too, is that men get a lot more bang out of being told that they're men than being told that they're smart. So remember that again. Don't tell yourself you're smart, tell yourself you're a guy. We did another study with girls at a science fair. These were middle and high school students at a college information fair. And what we wanted to get them also thinking about themselves in a different, non-gendered way, they pulled out a conformist attitudes questionnaire or a cafeteria food questionnaire. And so an example of the item from the conformist attitudes is I like to think of myself as a trailblazer rather than a follower. And 100% of people answer that question in the affirmative. No one wants to think of themselves as a follower. And they had very negative attitudes on this measure towards conformity. And incidentally, cafeteria food didn't do very well either. They either got that questionnaire before or after being set loose on a bunch of pamphlets that told them more about various majors in college, some of which were STEM majors. And the question is, if we could get girls to think of themselves as trailblazers, would they choose more pamphlets talking about STEM majors? And what we found was that if they got the conformity measure, the trailblazer measure before, twice as many girls were interested in math and science majors at the college level. So a little nudge about how they think of themselves made a big difference. So I just got back from, I think, what I'm now thinking is the best school in America. It's a little crappy little school near the West Virginia border with Maryland. And it's the kind of place, I was telling somebody earlier, you drive from the airport and what you notice immediately is the high volume of roadkill on the highway and big billboards that say things like, Jesus loves you, so don't kill each other. Not exactly the kind of welcome that says, New York Jews, come on down. You know, it's sort of this, Then I get to the school, and it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Not physically, but what they're doing with the children is just, it made you want to cry. It was so nice. And what the woman does all day long is give these kids an identity as scholars, as scientists, as good people. And she corrects them. So for example, and they're wildly successful. The principal came to the school, and when she came, none of the kids could pass the Maryland proficiency test. 2 years later, 3 years later, 50% of the students were at the advanced level, 100% of the students were proficient. I've never seen that before, that kind of turnaround. And so what did she do? Well, she does a lot of these identity things. Oh, one more amazing effect. 7 years after coming out of this school, when you look at these kids in high school, they comprise 75% of the kids taking AP courses in high school. These kids are dirt poor. Many of their parents are in prison. They deal with domestic abuse. They deal with all the kinds of things that we say limit kids' potential in school. So there's a lot of lessons from this school, and a lot of it has to do with these identity salience manipulations. So, and I think there's lots of lessons, but the thing that I want to call your attention to is whenever she sees a behavior she doesn't like, she says, Krellin kids, that's the name of the school, don't do that. So she sees a girl asking a boy to tie her shoe for her, she runs over, this is the principal, she runs over and says, no, 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 Krellin girls tie their own shoes. If they're doing a science project and there's something gross and a girl says, ooh, ooh, she says, Krellin girls don't say ooh. And she doesn't say it in a mean, nasty way. She just says it in a reminding kind of, this is who we are. We are special here. And what happens is that you notice that the kids start doing it to each other. So she tells me that when kids enter the school and they haven't been socialized to it, and they do something wrong, other kids say, no, 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 we don't do that here. So it's this group identity that ignores where you come from, but focuses on who you are now, and it's very special. Finally, my last bit of research, which is sort of where I'm going with this stuff, I went back to teach high school. And I went back to sort of examine stereotype threat in high school. And I had sort of one of those moments you have when you realize you're studying the wrong thing. You know, like, it was like I went in to study grains of sand on the beach. and I found a tidal wave coming of this other thing. And what I found was what I refer to as just this surplus meaninglessness among these students. Their lives in school, the work has no meaning for them, no meaning whatsoever. So we're teaching them SAT skills because we want to help them get to college. And they're cheating. And they're not doing their homework, and they're not paying attention, and they're like cat calls at women walking by. It's the kind of thing that makes you just so depressed. And so that's the feeling I came away with. This stuff doesn't have any meaning. We're talking about the future, using the future as a lever to get teenagers to care about stuff. Bad idea. They don't think about the future in an effective way. It doesn't have motive power for them. So what has motive power? And so I know that some of you here are studying meaning, and so it really got me thinking about how can we do these little nudge things on the meaning construct. How can we give students the motivation to do stuff that they don't like to do? Can we make it more meaningful? So this is just the beginning of a research process. There's a paradigm that we use where you write an essay and somebody from another race gives you scathing feedback on it. And the question is, and they tell you what you need to do to fix it. And the question is, will they send us back a revision? And the answer by and large is no. But could we make it more meaningful and perhaps let them get over the stereotype threat inherent in that situation? Here a white evaluator has told me that I cannot, that this is a bad piece of work. And traditionally in what you find is that there's a defense mechanism that comes up where people say, I got bad feedback because of my race, not because of the essay. This is terrible for learning because people you need to get bad feedback, constructive feedback to learn. So we added to this paradigm a meaning manipulation. So we tell black and white students, I'll just do a shorthand version of this, that we're doing a book. These are college students. We want to have you write an essay that will be published in a book if it's good enough, that a kid might read someday and say, the essay is about why somebody should want to go to college. So you should write about how much fun college is, how great it is, because kids are getting the message that they should go to college, but not why they should want to, why it would be enjoyable and fun. The manipulation in this case was for half the group, for half the people writing the essays, we add the line, and we are going to distribute this book to little kids in Harlem. Now there's some work in the past that shows that when people feel connected to their group, I think Andrew has done some work like this, that they feel that they feel a greater sense of meaning. Here's an opportunity to do something for your group by writing this essay. So we're halfway through data collection and the question is, do they send us back a revision? And out of 50 people so far, 12 have sent back a revision, because this is a real sting. They've been told that this is not a good essay and they have to do a lot to make it better. But the ratio, if they're in the meaning condition, 9 send back essays compared to 3 in the other condition. So if this trend holds, we may have a little finding here, a little tweak to give people a sense that what they're doing is important. And I should say that in this school, that I now think is the best school in America, there is not one moment when these kids are not convinced that what they're doing in this school is really important. So when they do science, when they're learning science, it's because they're actually doing science. They're doing environmental science, they're cleaning up a stream, they bring in experts to help them understand their environment. The kids were working so hard, but not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a sense of curiosity and passion, because they were getting to know their own environment. They were doing science. And I think far too often we do in schools, we ask kids to do problems that are two-dimensional. You know, if a train leaves Detroit at this speed and the other one leaves another city at this speed, that's a two-dimensional problem. These kids don't do two-dimensional problems, they do three-dimensional problems, which is what we were, which is what evolution designed us to learn for, is to solve real problems in our environment. And when kids get to do these, they become little scientists. And I invite you all to go visit that school because you will cry. It's so beautiful to see that. And so I will end with one of my other favorite quotes about differences in abilities. That is that nature may give us little differences, but we can enlarge people's capacities by the way we treat them. Understand how to nurture intelligence. We need to understand its nature, that it's both fragile and malleable. Thank you very much for listening.